So, first question that I did want to ask, because I think it's important to get you sort of why all this, why you've ended up, doing this. So, what was your inspiration to dedicate so much time? Because you're an academic, you've got teaching to do, and you've got, your own research strands to do. Why did you choose to do this? And, was it like a eureka moment, or was it like, did things build up to the point where you went, oh?
Yeah. So it was based on my personal experiences of being a PhD student. So in 2013, I embarked on a PhD that was investigating stereotype threat. So this is a famous social psychological phenomenon which proposes that knowledge of negative societal stereotypes, such as women are bad at mathematics, can have an influence on their performance. So for women, it has been shown to deplete their mathematical performance. And there's over 300 studies in this area. There'll be more now. In 2013, there was 300 studies. So when you read the literature, all the papers were beautiful. They were multi-study papers of numerous experiments that confirmed this stereotype threat performance relationship. So my PhD jumped in at the deep end to try and understand the mediators of that relationship. So why was it that women were underperforming when they heard these negative stereotypes? Was it performance anxiety? Was it working memory kind of deficits? Or was it actually that they're motivated to try and disprove the stereotype, but that pressure actually ends up having a paradoxical effect on their performance? And so I designed experiments and I tried to get the mediators, but I fell at the first hurdle because I could never get the typical stereotype threat effect. So you can't look at an underpinning mechanism if you're not even getting the baseline effect. And I had a hellish PhD experience because of this. I couldn't publish my studies because they were null. Peer reviewers were coming back saying that I must have missed something or there was a methodological flaw somewhere. And in year 2 of my PhD, I just thought, I need to quit because this is me. I am a bad scientist. Everyone else can do this and get the effects, but it must be something inherent in me that I am not able to do it, and therefore I'm a bad researcher. So thankfully, my supervisor at the time convinced me to stay, and eventually we did get some papers out, but it took a lot because we needed to kind of prove our null findings with advanced statistics such as Bayesian analyses and things like that. And so when I graduated, I just felt really kind of depleted and not very motivated to do research anymore. So I joined Lancaster University in 2016 as a teaching associate, and I just wanted to focus my efforts on teaching for a few years and see whether I wanted to go back into research at all. And this was kind of the turning point for me. So when I joined, there was an academic at Lancaster who's called Dermot Linnett, and on his office door he had loads of stickers about questionable research practices. And at the time it felt really scary, like, who is this person? Why have they got all these stickers on their door? What does it mean? But Dermot actually invited me to an open research working group. I had no idea what open research was. And in one of the first workshops that they did, they outlined kind of like a brewing replication crisis and the influence of questionable research practices on research outcomes. And I just felt like a light had been shone into my world, which gave me the answers that I was looking for and made me realise that it was not me and that actually the field was in quite a mess. and that everyone was talking about this in the corridors, but it was nothing you would ever see in the published literature or anywhere that you would look for it in, say, a scientific place. You wouldn't have found those answers. So anyway, through kind of my years at Lancaster, I ended up getting involved in registered replication reports, where we worked with over 200 researchers across the globe to try and replicate classic effects on priming. And stereotype threat is a priming phenomenon, and none of these replications were significant with tens of thousands of participants. So I think at that point, that was a real turning point for me, where I thought, you've answered my questions, thank you. I actually now want to go into academia, but I want to go in with the ethos of doing transparent, responsible, open research, but also teaching everybody else about this, particularly students and PhD students who have no idea and think that the problem is them.
Yeah, that's true. I had a similar experience doing my PhD. So my background is doing alcohol work, and beyond a few basic correlations, nothing really worked, unless I got people really drunk, and then everything works then, because obviously cognitive processes just fall apart. But there was one task, the cued go no go task, it's called, and there's this massive literature that's like, it's a measure of inhibitory control that's reliably impaired following a dose of alcohol above 0.6 grams per kilogram. And it's like, this works. And then I did it. It's like not even a sniff of a difference at all. And I had a conversation. I was at a conference with a PhD student whose lab does that task, and what was said was, "Oh yeah, it only works about 20% of the time, but we just publish them."
Yeah.
And you're like, and that's when you're like, oh. Wish someone would tell me that before I started.
Yeah, you're literally seeing the tip of the iceberg, aren't you? When you look at the published literature, it all looks rosy, but you don't see what's underneath the surface. And I think it's important to remember that is normal, because research is difficult and it's messy, but we need to be able to show people how messy it is as well.
Yeah, that's it. The amount of stuff and the amount of times I have to say to an undergraduate student, doesn't matter that your dissertation didn't find anything. You did it properly. That's good.
Yeah.
And
they worry about that, don't they? They think it'll affect their grade, when actually, I don't know where they've got that from, but I suppose they live in a world like us where they think, well, I can only do well if it's a positive result.
Yeah.
We think we can only publish if it's a positive result, when a lot of the mixed findings are more interesting, because you've got more to say about why it might have worked, or why it's confusing.
Yeah, I always say that if it's different from the literature, you've got a lot to talk about, your discussion, a lot to talk about. You can identify many different reasons for it.
Yeah.
And I think this leads us on actually quite nicely to the next question. Is sort of from the real broad research perspective, we know the specific things that are likely to drive the replication problems, with people, like dishonest practice, hacking and p-hacking. What do you think is like the sort of the underlying driving force that underpins this replication problem?
Yeah, so I think that the replication crisis, there was kind of key pivotal events that got us to this point where we're discussing things and we're doing something about it. Now, just to kind of rewind to the 1950s, there's a new paper by Daniel Lakens in 2023, which argues that social psychology actually experienced two crises. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, social psychologists were discussing issues of replication and reproducibility. And there's a lot of papers around that time that propose that many of the explanations might be things like publication bias, where researchers are pressured into finding positive or interesting results to publish. The incentive structure of academia, so being rewarded for quantity of papers rather than the quality of those papers. And also issues around questionable research practices such as harking, so hypothesizing after the results are known. And this is a real nice paper because it's a historical overview that argues that actually we've been here before and nothing changed, because 5 decades later we've found ourselves in the same kind of water. So what happened this time round? Why has all of a sudden psychology kind of met this inflection point where things are changing? And I'd argue that there was some key pivotal events that happened around the same time. And because they happened around the same time, it kind of caused public outcry. And with social media and our ability to kind of talk about this and discuss this in a more informal way, I think that the outrage kind of just grew and grew and grew. So around 2011, there was a paper by Daryl Ben, published in a really prestigious journal, and Ben provided evidence of precognition. And precognition is a phenomenon whereby simply it proposes that people can predict future events, which is outside of the realms of what we know is humanly possible. But across 9 experiments, Ben showed that people could predict a future memory task with above chance accuracy. And every single finding was significant or supportive of this phenomenon. So when that paper was published, there was outcry because people thought, well, this has gone through the peer review process where other researchers who are experts in the field will evaluate that paper. And they must have thought that it was methodologically sound and that the statistics were okay to publish this. But actually, when you just dig into it, there was a team of researchers, wagon makers and colleagues, who just argued that it was too good to be true, that there must have been null findings somewhere that were just being hidden. And what a lot of people don't tend to realise is that even when you're studying a true phenomenon, you will run into non-significant results. Yeah. So if this really was true, where were those non-significant results? At around the same time, you've then got Diederik Staples, who actually is the first person in psychology to admit data fabrication in his own research. And one of his papers was really societally impactful. And it happened at a train station. And what he wanted to show was that disordered environments, so messy environments, cause discrimination. So he did a study at a train station where it was around the time of a cleaners' strike. So the station was typically normally clean, and now it's very disordered and messy. And he wanted to see how far away a white person would sit from a African American person. And he supported a finding of discrimination in disordered environments. And in a paper published in Science, I think it was, he made some policy recommendations that the government should really tackle messy, disordered environments, because if they could, they would eradicate prejudice and discrimination. Yeah. And I can't quite remember, Paul, what led to him being found out now. I might have to dig back into that. But something had happened, and eventually he actually admitted to fabricating that data. And quite bizarrely, he's written, I always get confused between biographies and autobiographies, but one about himself.
Also, I think.
Autobiography.
Yeah, I think.
And he actually admits to going back to this train station when he was under investigation for academic fraud and feeling really kind of overwhelmed because he couldn't remember being there and he couldn't remember doing the experiment, and he'd made up his data basically in his office at home. And that book is it's written in Dutch, I think, but Nick Brown has actually translated it into English, and it's a very kind of eye-opening story, really, about how, due to pressures and I suppose pressures around your research career and people's egos as well, wanting to be a superstar, that it led him down this really dark path into research fraud. So I think those two things. So the Daryl Benn paper has never been found to be fraudulent, and I think that's important to state.
Yeah.
But I think that those two things happening at the same time really kind of got people talking. But what was different this time around as well was the advent of meta research, so kind of research on research, and a few big papers coming out which provided empirical evidence for the things that people were just discussing in the 1950s and 60s. So no longer was it kind of talk about the town. We actually had data to support the influence of questionable research practices on the false positive rate. So a paper by John et al. In 2012 defined and then showed the impact of questionable research practices. And then at the same time, a paper by Simmons and colleagues showed how easy it was to yield significant findings if you basically engage in p-hacking or harking, and actually doing a lot of these things all together can make a false positive rate of around 60%, like something you just would not want, when typically we want our error rates to be very, very small. So in psychology, as you know, around 5% is what we're willing to kind of play with. So I think that's kind of the events, and then a lot of the driving forces that underpin that are the world that we live in, the pressures we experience as researchers to publish, to get grants, to get tenure, to get promoted, and also the journal system. So we know that publication bias is rife, that journals typically want significant positive findings, and that's kind of created this. I don't think there's one explanation. It's all of these intertwining things that go together to create an incentive system that kind of has exacerbated these issues.
Yeah, it's all they have incentivized this. At the end of the academic system that exists really does incentivize this sort of thing, and it probably is, for certain people probably found it quite easy to do one thing. I did that. Okay, a little bit more and a little bit more, and and I think that John paper is a real eye opener. I use that, and and it's basically graphs. And there's the estimated rates after the self-admission rates. Even the self-admission rates are so high for all these things, and then when it's the estimated rate after that, that's an eye-opener. But there's almost graded as well, from things that they're all questionable, but all the way to falsifying data. And you can see in this, and that almost creates the slippery slope when you look at the frequency of that, and you can see how a small portion of people can end up at that end. And it's also, I suppose, is one of those things, is it doesn't matter if you have pre-registration and things like that. If someone's going to be that dishonest, then they're going to be that dishonest, and you've got to hope someone's going to find out by looking at the data and going, those standard errors very small, and that's and given the amount of publications, you probably are going to get away with it, because not everyone's got eyes on all the publications that are out there. So and it's and the environment, the academic environment, it doesn't excuse it, but you can see how that causes pressure on people, and how some people could be driven to it, and it is and it's a very worrying situation, really, when you look at that. I think
what's interesting with the John paper as well, if I recall rightly, they asked researchers to self-report on their own rates of using these QRPs, which were, as you say, surprisingly high, but probably still kind of, you've got the self-report bias and the fear of actually there being repercussions. But they asked whether they knew of anyone else who'd done this, so their colleagues, and the rates for that were like, I've never done this, but everyone around me is doing this. And I think that is really eye-opening as well. And I'm still really thankful for that paper, because I think at that time people were really worried that they were worried to admit that they'd been trained that way as well. A lot of us had actually been trained to use optional stopping, for example, where you keep looking at your data, peaking until you find significance, or keep collecting data, because we did not understand the influence it had on results. I don't think we just did not know. And I suppose when those things are normative and trained, that becomes really problematic, because people are worried, because they think, well, someone else told me to do that and I didn't know it was wrong. Whereas that paper has allowed people to put their hands up and say, actually, a lot of us have used QRPs in the past and we now understand that they're wrong, and we'd never use them again. But it was just, I think that's why people say it's in the grey area between kind of responsible research practices and fraud, because it's definitely not responsible, but does it go over that kind of red line into the fraud category? I think going forward it will, because people now understand it's kind of like unconscious bias, right? When you're made consciously aware of something, you've got to take action. But I think when people didn't know, you can kind of sympathise a little bit to that culture that they were in.
I think that that's right. You know, it's the sort of, oh, have you tried controlling for age? That just that throwaway little line, which is why are you controlling for age? Did you say you would? Is there a reason to control for age, or are you just hoping that something comes out of it? And I think that was so normal. I think that was put gender in there. And it's so easily done, and it's these. I do a few conference talks about like statistical practice, and I do this talk, and I call it statistical zombies. And these are things we know are wrong. There's papers saying don't do this, and they keep coming back from the dead, and they're just there, and it's like, will people stop doing this? And it's like the dichotomization of continuous variables is the classic. There's about 70 papers showing why you shouldn't do it. And then and if when I do these talks, I go whatever field. If it's like a conference on obesity, I'll say obesity median split in Google Scholar. It's not scientific. And then for 2024, and it'll be like 600 papers, and you're like, how's this happening? And I think that's also a fault of the peer review process as well. As you say with the Ben paper, if there's people are reading it, people are experts, but if they don't actually realise that things shouldn't be this perfect, or if they don't realise that, then that's I think it's a big issue. But I totally understand that this normative process, but now it's not normative, and I think and again I think this leads quite nicely on to the next question. Would you say things have got better over the last 10 years? And I think in part we've answered that, because it's not normative.
Yes,
which is probably one of the biggest battles. Stopping habits is really hard, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say absolutely yes. And because it's got better, this is why I am still in the field. So I think that if I would have just learned about the replication crisis and all the negatives, I would not have been here. And unfortunately, I think that some academics, really good academics, have left because they could not see a future career in the messy world that we used to be in. But I think the advent of open science has completely turned things around. So open science is an umbrella term which argues that knowledge of all kind, where appropriate, should be transparent, open, replicable, reproducible, accumulative, but also equal and kind of represent the humans that we are studying, both in terms of our participants but also the researchers who are in our field. And within that umbrella, there are many different practices that you have outlined in the chapter, such as study pre-registration. So I'm a real fan of study pre-registration, and that is basically a protocol of what you're going to do before you go and do it. So when I was a PhD student, I used to go out and collect data and then have a meeting with my supervisory team to try to work out how we were going to analyse the data. And now I look back at that and just think, I can't believe that that was even the world that we lived in, because at that point, you are biased towards what you want to find. You are kind of cherry picking different analyses because you don't yet understand your design, because you don't know what analysis you're going to use. So it's all a little bit backwards. Whereas pre-registration is a plan. You outline what are your research questions, what are the hypotheses, how many people am I going to recruit and why, and that's really important as well. How am I going to analyse this? What is kind of like my criteria for accepting statistical significance, these kind of things. And I think that really helps because A, it allows you to plan better studies, but B, it mitigates a lot of questionable research practices, I would argue, that would come into play if that pre-registration was not available. So things like you can't hypothesize after the results are known anymore because you've told people what your hypotheses are. So I suppose you couldn't enact QRPs, but it'd be very transparent to everyone else. So a pre-registration is held on a public repository, it is time-stamped, and it becomes publicly available at a certain date. So it would make it very transparent that you had engaged in QRPs, and I think it just protects researchers in a way from themselves.
Yeah.
So I do love study pre-registration. But I think a problem, I'll come back to that actually later, but kind of the gold standard of pre-registration is registered reports. So with a pre-registration, you do that kind of in your own office and you put it online when you're happy with it, but no one else looks at it until you kind of submit your final manuscript for peer review. And that can be problematic because if someone then shows you that you had a methodological flaw, it's too late. You ran your study, you thought everything was grand, but actually you've missed something. Whereas with registered reports, it's exactly the same as a study pre-registration really, but someone else, experts in the field, are vetting your protocol before you go out and collect your data and analyse that data. So registered reports split the peer review process in half. Usually you would send a paper with an introduction, method, results and discussion for peer review. Whereas with registered reports at stage 1, you show your reviewers the introduction, the method and the analysis plan. And if they're happy with that, they give you something known as in-principle acceptance, IPA. And basically the journal is then saying, we will accept your results, you will accept your final paper, regardless of the results, given that you stick to your protocol. So at stage 2, you simply append the results and the discussion section to your stage 1 report. And as I say, if everything is fine and rosy, publication bias can't play anymore because the journal said, we don't care about results anymore, we care about methodological rigour. And I think that should have always been the case, but it wasn't. So it's these things really. And I suppose I've jumped into the next question in a way. But I think the advent of open science, I would argue really it's a paradigm shift. Mm-hmm. And that has also helped research become a lot better. It's absolutely the reason that I am still here, that I want to do research, and that I want to kind of scream from the rooftops about open science as well. Yeah,
that's true. And I suppose clinical trials have sort of had this for a while when you pre-register trials.
Yeah.
They've sort of had that system, though it's a little bit different because the journal where you pre-register, it's not going to be where you publish it. But that system's been in place, though. Again, there's cases of trials which have done things that aren't consistent with what they said they would do as well, which we won't go into detail now, but I'm sure some people will know what trials I'm referring to.
Yeah, and I think, Paul, that supports a point, really, that there's a really nice figure somewhere. I can't recall where it's from, but basically it shows the amount of positive findings before and after trial registration came in. And as soon as trial registration was implemented, the results just flip. The majority are inconclusive or null. And I think even just showing that graph in a presentation, people go, whoa, we were in a real kind of problematic world, but look how good registration can be. Yeah.
So now, so I suppose moving on, so we discussed problems and solutions. I suppose now the sort of what I think is the tricky bit. It's sort of when it comes to students, undergraduate students, what can the undergraduate students do about this? So, can they, first of all, I suppose, can a student, is it easy for them to spot if the initiatives have been used when reading papers? What should the students look out for?
Yeah, definitely. It's a really good question. So I think what is great about the replication crisis in open science is that it really does improve students' critical thinking, because they don't read a paper with all of their trust being in that scientific paper, but they can kind of look for the advantages and the disadvantages of that research paper. So it really does help critical thinking. But I think that if you are trained to know what open science practices are, then you would be able to spot them. So, for example, a study may state that it was pre-registered, and it'll provide a link to the protocol. So they might use aspredicted.org, they might use the Open Science Framework, but they should provide a link to that. So a student could click on that link in the paper and see, okay, yes, this has been pre-registered. And again, the papers will state that the materials or code or data are publicly available. And I think what's interesting is more when there's the absence of those words. So when authors will, they won't ever state that something was not pre-registered. They should, but they don't. Mm-hmm. They don't ever say, oh, my code data and materials are closed. They're not going to tell you that. So I think it's the absence of open science practices that can make you be a little bit more critical. Now, the important thing to note here is that just because people don't engage in open science practices does not mean that that paper is inherently bad. Some researchers might still be using very responsible research practices, but they've maybe not learned open science yet or felt confident enough to engage with it. So I would just be careful of kind of a blank conclusion that no open science equals closed bad science. But I think that we can think about rigor and transparency when authors are stating that they have used these things. So looking at their data, because if it's open, they're willing for others to look at that and spot mistakes and errors as well, I think. But as well, I think it's important also to know that just because a study is pre-registered, for example, doesn't mean that it's got the most perfect design and analysis plan. You can still pre-register a complete shoddy research study. So you kind of need to use open science practices in hand with your critical thinking to think, okay, well, they pre-registered that they'd use the dot probe task and they've told us what the dependent variable is and it all looks great. But hang on a minute, there's this other paper that tells us that the dot probe task is really unreliable and it should not be used. So it's using kind of what they're saying, but like the broader literature around the measures, the methods, the analyses. What you were saying, Paul, about if it says about a median split and it's pre-registered, it's still not an appropriate analysis. So I think that's what you should do. You should use open science practices alongside an evaluation of the methods and analysis to really evaluate whether a study is strong or not. Also, things like how many studies are in that paper. Is it just one study that's trying to solve all the world's problems? Or is it a multi-study paper that's seemingly a little bit more robust? And things like, is the sample size large enough to detect the effects that the researchers seem to be bothered about? Yep. Or does it seem a bit too small and a bit shaky? Do they go beyond reporting p-values, which we all know and love, to report things like effect sizes or confidence intervals? And do they transparently report any data exclusions and why that happened? And I suppose one of the best questions to ask yourself, or even write down, is, would I be able to perform a direct replication of that study given what the authors have written? And if the answer is yes, then you can think that's a really strong, transparent paper. But if anything is missing, or if you're questioning anything, that is the critique of that paper. I think that's what I would, basically put yourself in the seat of a replicator and ask yourself, do they tell me enough to be able to go and do this again?
Yeah, I always say that's one of the things I always tell undergrad third year projects. I should be able to, even if you're using a task, I should be able to, if I could remember how to program, I can't anymore, be able to program that task to this millisecond. That's this, we hit that point of, well, what's the timeout in the trial? What's the gaps between trials? Everything, all that information. And I think that's a good point, because as soon as something's missing, like, what are you doing with the data? Are you outliers excluded? They're over 100 milliseconds or something like that. And as soon as that option's there, I think me and Dr. Andy Jones did a paper on the analysis and structural options of an addiction streak from the literature. And I think there was like over 100,000 different ways you can end up piecing stuff together. And it's like the addiction streak, but there's over 100,000 different ways we could actually set this task up and then analyze it and then trim problematic data. And when you realize they're the options available, and then and if you can't replicate from the method section, that leaves you so many options that could have been done, so you can't replicate. And where do we go from there?
I love that paper, and I love a lot of the papers that you have, because you were willing to admit to past mistakes as well. So there's a paper on basically your failed attempts at improving. I think it's the .pro task. That's fantastic as well, because you're telling people, look, based on all your recommendations of making things better, we still can't do it. So there's a big problem here. But as you and I were saying before, everyone still uses the .pro task. No, don't do it.
That's it. And the thing we found, when we're doing me and Matt Field years ago did all reliability analyses on our pre-existing data, and when we looked at Cronbach's alpha for some of these meshes was like 0.01, and it's like, you just might as well mash your face into a keyboard and get the data when the reliability is that bad. It's like your maximum possible correlation is so low. It's
and I think that's a really good top tip for students as well, because when you're trained in psychometrics, so things like questionnaire development and self-reports, reliability and validity are key to that, and you will not get a questionnaire published without that information. But for some reason, we never applied the same evaluation to experimental tasks. And that's why there's a lot of tasks kind of floating around that when we dig back into them, we think, that might not even be measuring what we think it's measuring, because it's so noisy. And there's a nice paper by, I think it's Parsons in 2019, that argues that psychology needs a standard kind of practice of evaluating all their tasks. And again, I think we've improved in that regard as well.
Yeah, definitely. You see a lot more papers now that actually, and it's that going into the methods, because it's funny. So that there's always that. One of the most interesting things is after I finished my PhD, did a lot of work on attentional bias. That I did a paper with some colleagues that was less than meets the eye, reappraising the role of this in addiction. And it was basically, as we were sort of making the point, part of it is like, there's been this rush to start applying this to how we can do behavior change in people. We're not even measuring it very well. And then we're trying to pull interventions from it. And it's flaky as a measurement in a correlational study. And then we're going to go, okay, well, maybe if we can change this process, we can help people with dependency. And it's, you know, I think you've got to take a step back sometimes, and there's that rush. And I think that's one of the things that we talked about really early on. It's that rush, isn't it, to the next big thing, grants, move on. And it's like, and it's unfortunately, it's not particularly sexy for a grant funder to be like, I want to improve the reliability of a visual probe task. Give me £600,000, please, because I know.
But it's so important, isn't it? And I think what's lovely, like yourself, myself, Andy, we've all gone to a world of like improving methodological rigor. And I think that is so important, but people are still unwilling to do it. So we've got a paper at the moment, and this is a bit of a deviation, but interesting for you, which is the test-retest reliability of common social cognition tasks. And someone on Twitter retweeted it and said, thank you for doing this really, really important work. Like it was a surprise, like it was voluntary and kind of like a career risk for me to have been doing this, because it's not this like science paper and I think it's so important that we do these things, and that we should also be recognised for improving kind of tasks and making our code open and our software open and things like that.
Excellent. So I think we talked about this a little bit before, and actually I suppose this is almost the next question is, what would you go back and say to yourself? Almost is, so we talk about problems, and there is a sort of, you could get to the point where you read this and go, well, what's the point? I can't trust 95% of the papers out there. What would you say to a student who thinks, is this just futile?
Yeah, so I was this very person. So I was very pessimistic about the state of our field when I first heard about the replication crisis. And a lot of the seminal studies that I'd grown up with and grew to love, such as stereotype threat, growth mindset, ego depletion, priming, seem to have gone up in smoke.
Yeah.
And I think the first thing is it's really important to question everything. So no matter what in life, it is good to have a critical eye and just think, is there two sides to that coin? And to make your own kind of judgments based on that critical thinking. But what I would argue, and I'd really tell students to get involved in as well, is that open science has reformed our discipline. I honestly do think that it has reformed our discipline. And I've been questioning recently whether we still find ourselves in a replication crisis, or are we coming out the other end of that now, knowing that we were in one and that we've improved things. And as a discipline, I think it's really fascinating to understand that these issues are present across all of science. So replication and reproducibility issues are also present in the natural sciences, which people don't tend to pick up on. So it's not just psychology. So it's not like you've made the wrong choice of what you've studied. But what's amazing is that psychology has been a trailblazer for these new initiatives. And I suppose we've gone beyond the practices of pre-registration and open code and data to actually reflect on who is represented in science and who are we actually inviting to the table. So thinking about diversity initiatives, equality initiatives. So I actually think now it's a really lovely place to be, and that students can get involved with open science as well. So for example, a lot of early career researchers have actually been the people to develop these initiatives, and students can do that as well. So journal clubs such as Reproducibility were created by ECRs, and Kate Button, a researcher at Bath, She provides the consortium approach to the undergraduate dissertation, so getting students involved in running large-scale studies together under a big team science approach, which is where you admit that you've not all got the expertise in the world, but you each contribute your expertise. So you might collect all the data together, but then one person might be in charge of doing like really beautiful figures because they like doing that and they can do that. One person might be in charge of checking the code because that's what they like to do. Another person might have done a bit of programming. So students can get involved in these open science initiatives. They can pre-register their work. They can get involved in replications. I've had students that have even published registered reports. So learning about this is really kind of key. And I suppose I'm hoping that those reading your book will feel the same, but when I teach students about the replication crisis and open science, they're actually fascinated and very, very engaged in this, because it shows that we are not all perfect and that we are kind of, we can make mistakes and that we're human, we're not robots. And I think that like kind of allowing a little bit of humanness in science is really nice as well. And what I would say is that they should feel excited because students are the grassroots of our discipline. So they might go on to do a master's in research, they might go on to do a PhD. And so learning about responsible research practices is like a toolkit that they can then bring into that world and make things better themselves.
Yeah, they can be the real advocates for change, can't they? Which is something, in a lot of ways, in another way, it'd be really hard to be an advocate of change, as a very early career as a student. But in this, you can actually do it, And I've in the past, I've had students who've asked me can we do pre-registration of my project as well, and it's sort of, that's really good to see it when actually you can see people have thought about it and they want to drive that in their own research. So it is always good to see that. It's. So, it's not that bleak then, is it, for students? I think that's the key point.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's, there is stuff that, there's stuff that you can do. So I just sort of, if you could, I suppose, so brand new undergraduate student, year one, okay, walking in, as we're speaking today, all my students are turning up in the department right now. I'll put this on a big screen. I'll do a cut out of this bit and just put you talking about this on a big screen. So if you could sort of advise, one thing they could do from the outset of the studies, so you're a brand new, fresh-faced student, what would you advise in this area?
Yeah. So in psychology in general, so even without thinking about open science, reading is absolutely key. And I don't think that any of us really read as much as we should anymore because of social media and the availability of information kind of everywhere. But reading journal articles will allow you to develop your writing skills first and foremost. And it'll allow you to start understanding how research is conducted and presented. And at first it might feel a little bit overwhelming because you'll get to a results section, there might be equations, there might be scary statistics, and it is okay to not understand that at the start, but over time reflect on the fact that you do start to understand those statistics and what they mean. So I think reading is key. I think also critical thinking in your education and everyday life is absolutely key. So as we were saying before, current research articles, particularly those that implement open science practices, are more trustworthy than what you might see on social media, for example. So you might see people talking about psychology on TikTok or Instagram, but again, just be aware that those kind of conversations have not been peer reviewed by experts in the field. So research papers still are kind of at the top of the pyramid of trustworthiness compared to what you might read on social media or even in the newspapers and in the news, because of kind of like sensationalizing, whatever that word. I think that's important.
Yeah.
But I also think that they should look out and try and understand the context in which research is conducted. And I do think we could do this more as lecturers as well. A lot of students believe that we teach and then we might go and sit in our offices and wait for emails to come through and wait for assessments to be kind of ready to mark. But our worlds are teaching and research. And asking your lecturers about their research, you'll always get a positive response. They're interested to talk about that. But learning a little bit about the kind of pressures we experience as researchers as well, the fact that it's a job. So thinking about the peer review process or the targets that we have to meet or the research excellence framework, for example, these kind of bigger things that interplay in research. And I think this just allows you to kind of identify how some of these issues were created and developed, but also see how they can be mended as well by changing the wheel or questioning certain things. So I think those would be kind of my 3 top tips for someone starting out as an undergraduate.
Yeah. And then I suppose when they're coming to the end and they're when they're doing their own research, whether this is a 3rd-year project or they've gone on to masters, would there be any particular, and obviously do everything we've talked about, or don't do the bad things we've talked about and do the good things that we've talked about. Is there, what would, if you could say, again, one brief piece of advice, when they're doing their research, what should be at the top of the mind when it comes to reproducibility?
I think reflecting on your own values and ethos as a researcher is really important. So do you want to implement open science practices, and why do you want to do that? I think sitting down and knowing who you are is really good, and having some reflexivity in the research process is a very good thing to do. But what I would say as well is, again, sitting back and reflecting on the skills that you're learning in research and how they apply to the graduate world as well. So don't just think, oh, in university I ran a research project and I was really good at programming and I got these data management skills and things like that. Think about how an employer would really value those skills as well. So you might have kind of developed a project, developed your data management skills through open data, anonymizing data, these kinds of things. You might have programming skills in, say, R, or even statistical software such as JASP or Jamovi that an employer would be really excited to hear about that as well. And I suppose thinking about kind of your knowledge about ethics and social responsibility. So being a responsible researcher in that context is great for the world as well, because it means that you're socially responsible. You think before you do, you evaluate well, and again, an employer would be really happy to hear about what open science is and how it's used.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, and that's a really good point. That it's not just, it goes beyond research then, doesn't it? This is about absolutely. you as a person, and and it's not only beneficial for research, it's beneficial for you as a person and career, and makes you a better, more rounded person. All in, and surely that is one of the ultimate goals of university. It's not just a knowledge base, it is about growth. And I think that that's an excellent point, Nana. I would have never have thought of it goes to that level, really, doesn't it? It really goes beyond. That's absolutely just fantastic conversation, that. Thanks so much for talking to us about all this. And I also think that every single person should be reading your A Student's Guide to Open Science. I think that's the key take home, is everything we talked about has gone into even more detail in your book. And I think everyone should be reading that book as well.
Oh, thanks, Paul.